Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Renaissance Lives, which is today dedicated to Andreas Vesalius, who lived between 1514 and 1564. Vesalius is probably the most influential anatomist of early modern time. His life is perhaps not so important or influential as what he produced, a book called The Fabric of the Human Body, more than 700 pages of anatomy, and this eventually earned him an appointment at the court of Charles V, where he spent the rest of his life. Now, Vesalius is important because his work is really the outcome of the encounter of humanism with science on at least three levels: on the level of text, on the level of images, and of course on the level of the new media of print. Thanks to the philological tools of humanism, Vesalius could re-examine and correct ancient medical texts, Galen in particular, and he could also occasionally challenge him with his hands-on experience. In terms of images, the many illustrations of the Fabrica impose classical art as the scientific template of the human body, and this was made possible thanks to Vesalius' very acute understanding of the new media of print. So these questions are among some of the questions explored in the book that we are discussing today, and which you can see on the screen, Andreas Vesalius, Anatomy and the World of Book. And so I am truly delighted to welcome the authors, Sachiko Kusukawa and Daniel Margocsy, who are both professor of the history of science at the University of Cambridge and authors of important contributions on Vesalius and on the history of early modern anatomy and of early modern science. So if we can begin the conversation, Daniel, if you want to perhaps ask the first question, and I think we agree that we would begin with talking about humanism.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And especially thank you, Sachiko, for giving us the opportunity to talk about a wonderful book that has been a true joy to read and think about for the past couple of weeks. I mean, if we are starting with humanism, one question I would start right from the beginning is how do you think Vesalius fits into developments in the early 16th century in general? And how does he innovate, if he does innovate, in what ways?
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the question. May I, in fact, first start with thanking more people who made this seminar as well as the books possible. I'm very grateful to Michael Lehman and Alex Ciobanu at Reaction Books for their patience in seeing this book through. And I'm very grateful to Francois for inviting me today, as well as John Millington for making sure that I know what I'm doing today, electronically speaking. So in terms of humanism, in many ways, I think Vesalius is quite a typical humanist in terms of he has a humanist education. He's very well versed in the works of Galen in the way that we would expect almost all humanist educated physicians to be at the time. One skill that I think was rather unique to him and a few others was, I think, the skill of dissection that he picked up in Paris, that clearly he was he was good with his hands. In that sense, I think he and his interest in Galen, of course, is very typical of the early 16th century interests of learned physicians at the time. I don't think I'm saying anything new here, because the scholarship by Nancy Shiraishi and Vivian Nutton and Andrew Cunningham has shown that there is this great renaissance of interest in Galen at the time. What I think is somewhat unusual about Vesalius is the fact that when he was inspired and read Galen, and particularly the anatomical administrations, which was a recent discovery, and he realized that that Galen had urged people to use their own hands, and he certainly used his own hands to dissect bodies in order to obtain knowledge, that Vesalius was inspired to do so himself and use his own hands and really try to get his hands on a lot of bodies to dissect. So yeah, he's inspired by humanism, but the anatomical practice he pursues was somewhat unusual at the time. He's not the only person who is interested in actually dissecting the bodies, but certainly that's what I'd say about Vesalius.
I mean, this is really fascinating, and it is really curious to see how you returned in your answer on several occasions to the organ of the hand, which features both prominently in the Fabrica and in your own book as a result. And I was wondering whether there is more that you could tell us about how you think Vesalius uses his hand and how that hand shows up in the Fabrica itself.
Yes, so thank you. That's a very helpful and useful question in terms of thinking about how I framed my book. So obviously Vesalius promotes the use of his hand, not just his own hand, but urges other people, particularly medical students, to use his hand. And I think the portrait of him in that sense is actually quite telling, in that he is actually showing a hand that's been dissected. And I think you can now see there that what you're actually seeing is the muscle of the fingers. It's where the well, the Latin name for the muscle is flexural digitorum superficialis and profundus. But what it actually means that, so there's a deep forearm muscle that moves the top joints of the four fingers, and that actually has to come through the other muscles that actually moves the fingers also. Sorry, I'm not explaining this terribly well. So the deep forearm muscle moving the top joints of the four fingers have to pass through the slit of the flexor digitorum superficialis. It's the muscles that are sitting over it, and the one from the under move the top joints of the fingers, and the one at the sitting over it actually moves the middle joints. So both together will make the hand do the gesture of grasping, right? So, and this particular arrangement, Vesalius was really very impressed, and he thought this was, close to, well, and he does say it's a kind of divine structure. So here he is showing essentially the muscles that make the hands, the fingers move. But what's interesting is he's not holding the instrument. It's actually on the table. And this is something that I've actually noticed after looking at these images for a long time, is that Vesalius's relation to his instruments are quite different from the standard ways in which, say, for example, Berengario da Carpi, the professor of surgery, who also wrote a lot on anatomy, had shown. So here in the middle, you see the heads of the if you like, the drill bits that you put on to drill into the skull, the human skull. And they are of different shapes because it is supposed to fit the type of injury that's happening in the skull. And Berengario essentially says, if you're a good surgeon, you are going to have as many instruments as possible, like these different ones to fit different injuries. And if necessary, you should be tailor making a particular drill bit to ensure that you can treat an injury. And it doesn't matter if you only use it once. In comparison, here is the image of the table of famous tables of instruments. All the instruments on this table are pre-existing everyday objects. They are razors, they are pen knives, there are forks that have been bent over, there are needles that have been bent over, and a pair of scissors and sponges, and also cords. And he says bookbinding cords from Germany are the best for tying up vessels. So and none of these are specifically made for him or for any specific task. And if you read through his instructions for dissections, very often, here's a saw that's used for cutting open the skull. And interestingly, any process that is of a dissectional nature, that's to say, any dissectional act is usually, well, usually shown in the initials, not in the main images. But what I was going to say was that when Vesalius explains how to dissect a body, he's actually very relaxed about what instrument to use. He says, okay, you can use a knife, you can use a blunt knife, but you can also use your hand, or you can use your fingers, or you can use a little curved needle. He's very relaxed about it. And this is, I think, is actually quite interesting, that he advocates using his hands, but he doesn't want to come across too much like a surgeon with tailor-made instruments.
I mean,
So, yeah.
no, this is a really interesting point, to sort of to keep the hand at a certain distance, show it, as this magnificent creation that you yourself use, but at the same time, you do not want to put all the emphasis on the manual labor of surgery and dissection. And I mean, it does, raise obviously really important questions about the relationship between the professional status of Vesalius, his aspirations, and the professional status of everyday surgeons, the relationship between book and manual labor in any kind of crafts in this period, right? So I was wondering, right, is this movement, as you say in the book, then also partly one way of positioning yourself to get a job?
Yes, that would be, that is actually my take on these two books, the Fabrica and the Epitome, that were published in 1543. So the reason why I say this is because Vesalius came from a family of physicians in distinguished royal service, as we know. We also know his father was illegitimate and only rose to the rank of imperial apothecary, which of course is quite impressive, but he was an apothecary. So recovery of the family honor of imperial service as a physician, I believe, was very important to him. So when he went to Padua and when he was appointed professor of surgery, and Padua, of course, is a famous university, as everybody knows, a normal academic career rising through the ranks of professorships would have taken him about 10 to 15 years to get to the top. And then from then on, one might get appointed to a significant post, such as physician to a pope. But I think Vesalius was in a hurry. And most of publications on anatomy up to his time were mid-sized books, say page height about 20 centimeters. Fabrica was a bigger book, 43 centimeters or bigger. So it's a folio, it's a bigger, and near 700 pages. It's a really big book on anatomy at the time, and it's got large numbers of beautiful illustrations. Now, Epitome was much slimmer, less than 30 pages, but it was 57 centimeters high in terms of sort of page size. This is probably as big as a paper as you can get at the time in Basel. So he created the biggest and most beautiful books on anatomy, and he saw that as a ticket to attract the attention of the emperor, which we know he did do successfully, and within months of the dedication of these copies, he does become imperial physician.
You mentioned, right, that these are big books that are beautiful with wonderful images. But I think in the book you also explain quite importantly that not all of the images are beautiful, nor is their function simply just to please the eye, although sometimes they do. Is there more to be said about than what these images actually do for Vesalius, for his imperial and less distinguished readers?
Interesting point. I do wonder. So there are certainly sort of beautiful pictures, or I mean, there are a lot of beautiful pictures of the human body, as you can see here with the famous muscle men. But what's interesting, of course, is that as in the picture of the Belvedere torso, where Vesalius had embedded the renal and seminal veins, as well as kidneys, embedded into the classical torso that was fairly well known by then. And to your left here, you have Martin van Heemskerk's sketch of that in Rome, in the Belvedere in the 1530s. But so mounting or embedding an anatomical structure into this kind of sculptural figure was a way to certainly dignify the anatomical structures, and also reference sort of heroic and idealized perfect figures of the human body. But also he was expecting readers who knew the artistic trends of the time to be able to spot that. And certainly also the figure next to the Belvedere torso, the very famous sort of the skeleton ruefully looking at a skull, which is placed on a sarcophagus, and it has on the side of the sarcophagus a famous quote, "Vivitur ingenio." It starts as "Vivitur ingenio, caetera mortis erunt." At the time believed to be from Virgil. These are all kind of classical quotations, quite overt ones, that you expect any humanist scholar or any princely, educated, civilized person to be able to recognize. So there are these cultural layers that are put on the pictures of the human body, certainly for his audience. That said, then there is this rather unusual figure that shows the thorax of thorax of a man who looks unusually dead, and he's and you can probably see on around his neck that there is a remnant of a noose, which is then used to lift up the breastbones, so that you can actually see the interior of it, and then also see the lungs inside. And this figure is also unusual because you can see the clothes on the bottom half. He's still wearing his trousers, so it looks as if this is somebody who was possibly executed by the noose. And and in terms of the lung, just in case, I probably should comment on the fact that the right lung shows only 2 lobes. In humans, there are 3, but this may well be Vesalius just following Galen, who actually says that there are 2 lobes. But so this is actually quite an unusual but interesting reference, I think, to some of the dead bodies, the cadavers that he must have used when dissecting or looking for bodies. So in that sense, one might say this is not exactly your beautiful classical human body.
I mean, this is really interesting, and the point you mentioned about the lobes brings us, to a really important question. So it does seem to me, right, that he's doing certainly a lot of really interesting things about the images. But when it comes to telling us things about the body in text, how innovative is his approach to the human body? Does he have a view or a vision of the human body that is entirely traditional? Is he a disruptive genius, or is he something in between?
I may be I may come across as somehow kind of slightly conservative and stuck in the mud, but often Vesalius is regarded as a radical revolutionary character in anatomy. And I think we have to be very careful about this, because one of the things that Vesalius really does do is that he does dissect the human body, and then he does realize that Galen's descriptions were based on animal anatomy. And so he goes on to correct in 200 places that Galen wasn't accurate in his descriptions. And again, that's actually not that hard, because Galen himself often says that actually I'm using an animal, or he refers to the animal anatomy very frequently. So here in the middle, you actually have, there were 2 figures from 1538 that he had published before the Fabrica, and these 2 show the 2 vascular systems essentially of Galen. The one to your left is the one where it shows the venous system based on the liver. That's to say, the liver transforms highly the substance from food into blood, and then the blood is carried through the veins all the way to the body, and then it's consumed in all parts of the body. Yes, the liver is really quite exaggerated, but this is how he sees the veins. And then the figure next to it, which is the arterial system, which is based in the heart, okay, is where so the arteries from the lungs will bring in air into the heart, and then from the heart the arteries will with the vivifying spirits will again be not circulated, absolutely not circulated, but will be sent around the body. Now, for this to work, that the blood created by the liver has to move into the arterial system, and this Galen posits is done through the pores in the walls of the heart. Now, Vesalius looks at the wall of the ventricles of the heart, left and right, and he says he can't see them. He really can't see them. But that's where he stops. He's not quite sure what's going on, but he says he can't see them. But that does not move him to then completely then give up on these two but interlocked at the heart systems of the veins and the arteries. What he certainly does do in the Fabrica is at the top of the arterial system, you see at the top the head, a kind of net at the other side. So that's the vein. So that side, that there is a funny net shown at the bottom of the brain B. So that's the reta mirabile. And Vesalius says in Fabrica that this doesn't exist in humans. Again, this doesn't mean then he's going to then dismantle the entire system of veins and arteries at all, and nor does he think about, nor is he thinking that the humoral system should be abandoned either. So I guess what I'm trying to point out here is that Vesalius's correction of Galen were morphological, but that does not induce Vesalius then to completely dismantle the physiological system or arrangements that the Galenic system had set up. So, and he certainly hasn't come up with circulation either. So, in that sense, he hasn't really smashed to pieces the Galenic system. And I wanted to show you here, next to the arterial system, a page from a book, which is a copy of a book now in Manchester, John Ryland's library. And this is a book, this is actually a text of Galen on the use of the parts, as you can see. But the annotation, the visual annotation, sort of pictorial annotation to the right here, actually is a copy from one of Vesalius's muscle figures. So, and this we know, we can pretty much date the person who is 1546 or so. He is writing and annotating, pictorially annotating a book by Galen, using copying images from Vesalius's Fabrica, which seems to indicate that certainly there's a contemporary reader who didn't think that there was a dramatic difference in what Vesalius was presenting and what then Galen was writing. So he could use Vesalius's pictures to understand Galen better.
I mean, I think this is really interesting, and it does explain why it is really in the second half of the 16th century when we see the greatest interest in the number of editions in Galen across Europe, and how to some degree Vesalius's Fabrica doesn't change the predominance of the Galenic system radically. But I think it also brings up a really important point about Vesalius talking, in that he points things out. I cannot see here really a hole, and then he leaves it there. And there are a lot of such silences, I think, in the Fabrica, where, I mean, he certainly doesn't refrain from attacking Galen vehemently if he wants to. But say, when it comes to the brain, he's quite clear that there are certain things that I'd better not talk about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you. So this helps me to refer to this particular picture woodcut here, or from Gregory Reich's textbook, that Vesalius and this particular image of the ventricles of the brain. It's a medieval idea that perception, common sense and also some intellectual activities such as imagination and memory take place in these cavities of the head. And Vesalius was made to copy this drawing when he was studying, and he really seems to have hated this idea, and he even criticizes this image in the Fabrica. But what's actually interesting is, so Vesalius, when he does do his dissection of the brain, he in book 7, he clearly identifies that there are cavities in the brain, but he doesn't allot them the medieval ideas of common sense and fantasia or memoria at all. And the reason he doesn't want to go there partly is because he says, well, actually, the structure of the brain is the same same between humans and animals. And if there are functions, particularly to do with the human intellect, human rational soul, that's to say understanding and imaginations or whatever, if those are sort of unique to the human soul, then the structure of the brain itself does not show it. So that's, except for the fact that the human brain is bigger. So, and that's where he just kind of stops. Again, he's not kind of pushing and saying, okay, shall we go to the nerves to think about brain activity, etc. He just doesn't go there.
Well, I mean, I think that is really interesting, and I think it shows both what the human body can tell us about human beings and to some degree what it cannot. You very interestingly mentioned at one point, right? And I think, that was in quite a distinction from what we've just discussed vis-a-vis Galen and the earlier scholars, that Vesalius is quite insistent in making a book that is bigger than, well, not anything, but almost anything that had come before, right? And so which brings us to the question then, is it his book? Or is this the book produced by a team? I think in one of the chapters you end on the point that there is a publisher, Operinus, but Operinus kind of does this book and then leaves it at that and doesn't end up spending the rest of his life, with the exception of the second edition, producing really exciting illustrated encyclopedias of anatomy. So can you tell us a little bit more about this world in which Vesalius is bringing out a big book?
Thank you. So we know that Vesalius could draw or did draw, because some students actually says that he drew in the dissection hall. But for the images of these books, there must have been, well, I mean, we know that there was more than, because there were multiple artists involved. And in this period, with producing something like a woodcut, we would expect craftsmen who would be doing the drawing from the body or the cadaver, and then woodcutters, specialized woodcutters, who will be then cutting the wood to create the woodcuts. And they may be different people at times. There are people who can do both, but quite often they are separate people. And Vesalius seems to rely on a multiple number of artists for this. We know that the woodcuts were prepared in Italy, and the blocks were then sent over the Alps to Operinus. And there is a famous letter by Vesalius to Operinus, specifying the fonts that Operinus has to use, and then also how so one of the things that Vesalius actually asks of Operinus is unusually to use the internal margin of the page so that references to images can be made. So uses of outer margins for summarizing the contents of the text, etc., is a fairly common thing. But use of the internal margins is rather unusual. And in some cases, there are huge numbers, and this has to be in tiny font, and it has to be keyed to the main text. So this is really fiddly work that Vesalius asks Operinus to do, and he does do it rather well. This book must have been a huge effort on the part of the printer to produce. It's got woodcuts, it's got text, both italics and Roman, sort of big initials, and then margins, use of margins both outside and inside. So it is a great demand. So it's not clear to me why anybody would take on such a book. I think Operinus, and very few printers would want to take it on because it seems like a rather risky thing to have to do, even if Vesalius was paying for all the images. And I think Vesalius was rather lucky to know it's very likely that he knew Operinus before, when he had published much smaller books earlier, that he must have come across Operinus in Basel. And of course, Basel is full of printers in this period. But it seems that Operinus really, he's a highly trained and a really he knows his languages, and he can deal with humanist demands of the languages. And I think Operinus is somewhat unusual in that I think he's a risk taker as a printer. So because before Vesalius arrived in Basel to oversee the publication of this book, he was in prison. Operinus was in prison for having printed the Quran, and before that he was printing works of Paracelsus that the medical establishment in Basel thought that was terrible. So it's, if you just look at what Operinus was printing, it's not obvious at all that the Fabrica should be printed by Operinus. But I wonder if there was some kind of personal connection, or Vesalius managed to persuade Operinus that this was something worth doing. What's interesting is, so I think Operinus was actually very important in producing this really nicely printed book. And while, as we've already noted, that Vesalius made his career from this book, it's interesting that for Operinus, I don't think this kind of changed his sort of business model, or it didn't sort of do much for him. It's not as if, lots of people started to come to him to ask him to print hugely illustrated books, as you say. He keeps on sort of finding heterodox thinkers to publish, but then he also takes on the Magdeburg centuries, the really enormous, huge Protestant history of the church. And so it's very difficult to tell what Operinus really thought he was doing with this book, if that makes any sense.
I mean, that is really interesting to think that, previously we just noted how Vesalius goes silent on certain occasions, so we don't quite know what he really thinks. And then with Operinus, we are even more in the dark. But of course, when Vesalius visits Basel, one of the things he does, he also articulates a skeleton that is still visible today. And I think it brings us nicely to this very question of what your book, one of the really interesting of the many brilliant points this book makes about the making and unmaking of the human body, right? And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about precisely this idea that in order to understand the human body, we obviously need to dissect it and cut it up, but we also need to understand how it is constructed and in the process reconstruct it ourselves.
Thank you very much. So this is the point, I think, that the Fabrica and the epitome together are making for Vesalius. And we've already noted that Vesalius believes that the use of the hand is important. And in the Fabrica, he had one of the longest chapters in the book is when he explains how to articulate a skeleton. He goes into almost loving detail about how to boil down the human skeleton, the human body, in order to access the bones. And at the stage of cleaning or cleaning and drying the bones, Vesalius says, look, actually, you must not let this process of drying and handling the bones go to your servants. You must do it yourself. Don't leave it to the servants. You have to do it. And the point is that he says this way you will understand the texture and all the indentations that each bone will have. So this is a way for everybody to master manual dexterity about the bones. And he says, and for studying the bones, the best thing is to just leave all those bones sort of loose. But he says, then he goes on again in unbelievable loving detail, saying, okay, and now I'm going to show you how to put the bones back together into a skeleton from the feet up. So the initial P shows how then the putti are starting to put the bones back together to form a human body. So in the Fabrica, he's shown how to, take the body apart and then create a skeleton. And I think that an analogous thing is done for the body by a paper proxy in the epitome, where in the epitome there are sheets of printed organs and vascular systems that then the readers are invited to cut up. And here, this is a rather beautiful example, colored example, now in the Cambridge University Library. It is online, and you can actually see more of the details of this paper mannequin. But the whole idea is, and perhaps you can see how fine the cut must be if you're going to cut along the veins and arteries, and then you are invited to put this two together. And I think this is the paper equivalent, I believe, of the proverbial pulling apart the clock and putting it back together process, in the sense that if you taking apart the clock affords the opportunity for opportunity to understand how the parts make up the clock. Putting it back together will be you can only do it if you understand how the parts can be put together and then made to work. So if you can put, so if you're able to put the clock back together, it means you know how the clock works. So I think something akin to that, even if it's in a somewhat crude paper proxy way, is what Vesalius is inviting his readers to do with the epitome.
I mean, this is, I think, a really interesting point, both to think about the media technologies and paper technologies that Vesalius invites the readers to employ, and he supplies the elements for it. But also to think about the fact, right, that much of the Fabrica is about bones and muscles, right? Which in that case really seems to suggest to me, as you say, right, that these are absolutely essential if we want to understand the construction of the human body from the ground up. I mean, would you agree with such a view?
Yes, yes, I would, and of course, interestingly, the Fabrica, of course, starts with the bones, which is how Galen's anatomical administrations also start. And so it's almost like you have and Galen also says that the bones are like the walls of the house. So it's a fundamental structure. And then muscles are then comes the chapter on muscles. So then you put the muscles onto the body, and then you actually put the veins, embed the veins into the body, and then you put the organs in. So it seems to be that although it is actually about anatomy and there's a lot about dissection, the way in which the book is presented seems to be about making the body from the inside, the bones out.
And I'm wondering just very briefly about, obviously this to some degree goes back to Galen, and we could restart our conversation about the role of humanism in the Fabrica. But to some degree, is this also something something that has to do with the tremendous importance of bones and skeletons in European religion and art in the period? Whether we think about relics or whether we think about the danse macabre that decorates so many churches already in the 15th and 16th centuries.
Certainly, that may well have been the case, but of course, another thing that may also be affecting the focus on bones may well be that bones preserve much better, so there are a lot more of them. Vesalius sort of spending time in the cemetery of Innocents in Paris, playing with his friends with bones, seem to be, so there are ossuaries in cemeteries, whereas preservation of the soft tissues is not something that happens until the 17th century. So that may also affect how much you can write or study about the bones.
No, I think this is really fascinating. As we slowly come to the last part of our conversation, I just wanted to open up the discussion a little bit and ask you about the Fabrica and your personal take on it. One way to think about the Fabrica is that it's a really impressive book with wonderful images. Another way to think about it, it's 700 of extremely complex Latin text that on occasion, frankly, is really boring. As you were working through the book, were there certain passages or parts where you were like, for the larger readership, sort of like, these are the passages that might be really interesting for everyone, and not only for those who want to write a book about Vesalius? Is there sort of like facets of the Fabrica that, we should really engage with more intensively?
That's a really interesting and fascinating question. there are indeed, pages and pages of Vesalius where the description seems to be a bit stilted, and actually they tend to be a compilation of the Galenic text without much sort of comment on his part. There are certainly parts around the area of his when he actually talks about the fact that he couldn't find the reta mirabile, for example. There are sort of a lot of sort of personal comments there. And from time to time, if you are into the personal outbursts that he has against Galen, there are plenty of them around. But what I found most fascinating is actually reading through the legends to the illustrations, and looking at the illustrations in relation to reading the text and the images together, because he actually says a lot about what parts of what shape or parts these organs are like. And it's actually really fascinating how he tries to really explain things visually very often, but then there's quite often he uses analogies. And so I do find, and I think this is where kind of really you can see him really reveling in the details that he has found. So I would actually recommend reading the illustrations with the keys, legends to them.
I mean, it is absolutely fascinating that it kind of like reveals to us Vesalius the poet, who comes up with similes that blow our minds. And it really interestingly, right, brings us back to the very beginning of today's conversation when we looked at Vesalius and the dissected hand, right? Where it was really interesting for me to be reminded that even there, at that very image, and I think we are just about to see it, hopefully, there is a caption, right? Saying, if I remember correctly, let's not forget chapter 30, what it says about this very topic. It's not this image, but the other one, the portrait of the author. Yeah, right. So if we zoom in, right there, right, it says something about chapter 30 right there, right?
Yeah.
So even to understand the portrait of the author,
Yeah.
we need to go consider what is in the text.
Yes, indeed. The way in which he, I think, interweaves text and image is, I think, really very interesting. Of course, scholars will point out that that if you go to chapter 30, you don't find this section, because things obviously the text had moved on. The chapter number is wrong, but you will find it. That chapter number does refer to the the chapter which describes the muscles moving the fingers are in a different number, but yeah.
Well, blame the printer.
No, with the woodcutter here, but no, the point is, your point is absolutely right. Yeah.
So I was wondering, as you were writing this book, what was it that you learned, sort of like, that really struck you about Vesalius, but also about the process of writing a book?
What I really found fascinating was that, and I had been studying Vesalius for a while, but I had not really appreciated until I really thought about writing this book about how visually aware he was, to the point of, to the point of thinking about the visual aspect of not just illustrations, but also initials and lettering and so on, and also the layout of the page. But I had also not appreciated the material dimension of the books until I really started thinking them as, okay, what are these objects if we think of them as books? Every time, I was going to the library, rare books library, I was thinking, gosh, this is a very heavy book to be picking up. And it's the material dimension to it, but also how then he really seems to be pushing the medium of print into doing something rather unusual with his usual in terms of making the reader do things, so become more interactive with the book, rather than thinking of a book as something that you just read from cover to cover, from one direction to another. It's a lot more complicated than that. And certainly with the images and the legends, you have to kind of keep on, turning the pages back and fro all the time. So it's a very different form of a reading experience. In terms of writing the book, an interesting point. So I thought that there is already a rather fundamental biography by O'Malley on Vesalius. And I thought what my contribution could be is to focus on the book that he had made, because it was such an important book that really sealed his career, but also defined his reputation from that moment until to this day. I thought this, if I could actually somehow convey what was unique and interesting about this book, then that will be a really nice thing to be able to do.
And I think that is really interesting to think. I mean, as a corollary, would you say Vesalius is then a one-book man?
We know that he wrote lots of, other books. They are smaller, of course, but I think the Fabrica was the 1543 edition was the book that was important to him. That said, of course, he did publish the second edition, the 55 edition, and according to Vivian Nutton, he was preparing the third edition. So, but it is still the Fabrica. And I do think so. The central idea of Vesalius was that this human, in a book on human anatomy, actually is about making. It is how a body is made, and this is a central idea. And I think, yeah, in that sense, that is the theme that goes through all the editions, I think.
No, I mean, thank you. And I mean, I just want to mention, right, that, just as, one learns a lot about reading Vesalius's Fabrica, we all can learn a lot from reading, Sachiko's absolutely wonderful book, both about the Fabrica, but also, I think, about the art of writing. And it really beautifully elaborates the various themes we discussed. and also provides certain stylistic techniques that really impressed me and made me want to write a similar book at one point in my career if I can. The way, say, the chapters end at a moment where you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't think about it. And then there is a break to give you a space, and then a new chapter begins and with a new topic. And it allows you really to carefully interact, just as with the Fabrica, with Sachiko's book, and continue the conversation on your own in your study. I don't recommend getting the scissors and cutting up the book, however. But otherwise, I hope that everyone will have a wonderful time engaging with it, just as I did. So, Francois, is this the moment where we open up the conversation?
Yes, and that's a very kind conclusion from you. Thank you very much. But yes, indeed, it's the time to open the conversation to the audience. I suggest you send me your question through the chat, but you can also use the raise hand question, the raise hand option, and I will let you speak. As you're preparing your question, maybe I have a small question for Sachiko, about this question of making and unmaking the body. It seems to be the traditional way of imagining the human figure in artistic education. It's already mentioned in Alberti, who takes it on from artistic practice. And it continues well into the 17th and 18th century. That is, imagining the figure from the bone to the muscle to the skin, but also imagining the same figure in a variety of positions. And these two aspects seems to me very, very essential to Renaissance artistic thinking. And it begs the question of the relationship between Vesalius and an artist and their way of thinking. And I wonder if you have some comments on this while we're waiting for other questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, first of all, for the very kind comments about the book. I really appreciate it. And but also in terms of the relationship between Vesalius and the artists, I wonder if they are actually inhabiting the same world in which people imagine the human body as something starting with the bones and putting the muscles on, etc., and then put the clothes on. It's sort of inside out type of way of looking, or sort of this is how you can imagine making a body, perhaps. But certainly in Vesalius's case, he has a good precedent for proceeding that way because of Galen.